My name is Stephen Deaton, and welcome to the Law of the Lord podcast, a production of the Newton Church of Christ in Newton, North Carolina. The aim of this podcast is to study God's Word for a deeper understanding and to see how it applies in our lives. Thank you for listening. We encourage you to search the Bible to see whether or not we are speaking the truth, because the Bible is the truth. It is the law of the Lord. In this episode, we look at Abram's call by God. This man we better know as Abraham is described as the father of faith. He's a great patriarch known for his love and devotion to the Lord. He was not without fault, however, but he was dedicated to serving God and led his family to do the same. We take some time to look at the very beginning of his record in the Bible to motivate us to great faith, as well as to warn us about the danger of wavering in our faith. Before we get into the study now, please hit the subscribe button to be notified of new episodes. Now let's study the law of the Lord together. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3 say this. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." As we see this, we call to mind the fact that this man, Abram or Abraham, was called to do God's will. He was called to serve God, and he was called out of a society that generally did not know God. When God called him and gave him these promises, he commanded him, first of all, we notice, to leave his home. It says to call him out of his country, to leave that land in which he lived. Now, that country was Ur of the Chaldeans. It was over in the eastern part of Mesopotamia. It was an advanced civilization, according to the Heart of Hebrew History by H.I. Hester. He said that there are large libraries there. Astronomy, mathematics, and other sciences were taught in a formal, organized way in that culture, that society. They had elaborate buildings that testify to the knowledge and the skill of the engineers as well as the craftsmanship. They had banking and legal professions that had been developed. An orderly government was established, and so it was not just a small village, if you will. It wasn't just a tribal type of thing, but it was most definitely a well-established, mature society with that orderly government. They had the solar year calculated. They had time divided into 60 seconds for a minute and 60 minutes to an hour, which is, of course, something that we follow today. These are the people who came up with that. They had there in that place not only the advancement of knowledge of culture in many different ways, but of course it was pagan. And it was the home of the temple to the moon god called Sin, S-I-N. Now, that was the country, so it was a highly advanced civilization. It says he is to leave his country, Genesis 12, verse 1, but then to leave your family. That family there is considered the extended family. So your aunts, uncles, cousins, people further out on that family tree, if you will. And it says, and from your father's house, you see how the Lord distinguished between family and father's house. So family you might even think of that as kind of the tribe that you're in this larger society. But it says from your family and from your father's house. That's personal. Your father, your mother, your brothers, your sisters, that you're going to leave those people that you are the most closely related to. and you need to leave them and go to a different land. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. But remember that Abraham's family, that they were idolaters. You get all the way down to the book of Joshua, when Joshua and the children of Israel finally go into the land of Canaan. They take the land of Canaan. Joshua is bidding them farewell. And it says in Joshua 24, verse 2, Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel, your fathers, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, dwelt on the other side of the river in old times, and they served other gods." This is that occasion where Joshua put the challenge before the children of Israel that there were others who served the false gods, and he calls upon them to put away the gods that their father served on the other side of the river, and they were to serve the Lord. So he said, "Choose this day for yourselves whom you will serve." And he said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Not the gods, the idols of our patriarchs, of those who came before us and lived on the other side of the river. So he's calling Abram in Genesis 12 to leave that culture, leave that society that was highly advanced, a lot of benefits. You just think about a settled dwelling there, how all the modern conveniences would have been there. The things they need for their day-to-day life are in abundant supply in a society like that. And he says, you need to leave there and go to a land that I will show you. Not a land that Abram knew prior to this time, but a land that God would show him. In fact, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8, when the Hebrew writer is talking about these great men and women of faith in the Old Testament, he makes this mention in Hebrews 11:8 of Abram. "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." What kind of faith would it take to respond to God's call to leave your country, to leave your family, to leave your father's house, to go to a land that you don't know anything about? You've never been there. You didn't know where you were going. You didn't know if you were headed east, south, north, west. You didn't know how far away it was. You didn't know any of those things. You're just setting out and following God's leading along this journey. Well, understand that he lived a nomadic life from that point forward, that while he was there in Ur of the Chaldees, he was in a relatively settled life, regardless of whatever else may have been going on, what he might have been occupied with day to day. Maybe he had herds and all of that, and he went out into the fields, but he was there. And he's being called to leave there. And we know from reading the Bible account of Abraham's life then that he went from place to place. And he would settle for a time, but he really lived a nomadic life. Again, the heart of Hebrew history says that he was going to live like a shepherd or a farmer, if you will, in some respects. And it was a highly honored and respected way of life. Now, Abraham, we want to remember, was the chief leader of his family. And a man like this, who led his own clan, if you will, was not only the chief, the father, the patriarch of the family, but he was the military leader of the family. And here at a time before the law of Moses, he was the priest, he was the intermediary, he was the leader in worship and religious practices for his family. He was the judge in civil matters. And so if there were disputes among people under his leadership, he would be the one that would hear that case and he would settle that. The land of Canaan at this time was in transition. So he's leaving a settled, highly developed society and going to a society that was kind of in upheaval at this time. Things had not gone well. The previous urban society that had been in Canaan land had collapsed, according to Willis in his commentary in Genesis. And it was largely at this time an agrarian society when Abraham entered into Canaan. So God called on him, Genesis 12:1, to get out of his country, from the family, from his father's house, to a land that I will show you. It is that Canaan land we know eventually where he ends up. Now, what promises did God make to Abram, and when were they fulfilled in Scripture? Because we read here, verses 2 and 3, different things that God says, here's what I'm going to do for you. You leave your land, you leave your country, you leave your people, and go to this other place that I'll show you. And then here's what I'm going to do for you, Abraham. So there was a reward, there was a benefit for Abraham to do what God is calling on him to do. And the first thing that he says is that I'm going to give you this land, right? Because in verse 1, he says, go to this land, and it's more than just go there and dwell there. That's not the end of the story, that he would be there and not have any stake in that land. Now, it ends up being fulfilled in his descendants. We realize that. But he's saying, I'm going to give this to you. This will be your land. And that is repeated in Genesis chapter 15. Remember that there in verse 1, the Lord is reassuring him, don't be afraid, I'm your shield and your exceeding great reward. This is the occasion where he shows him the stars, and we'll come back to that in just a little bit. But then in verse 18 says, the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Euphrates, the great river, from the river of Egypt, to the great river, the river Euphrates. So from the river of Egypt was a river in the southern boundary of Canaan land. It's out on the Sinai Peninsula, and it's historically been the border of Egypt. And he says from that southern point, the river of Egypt, all the way up to the Euphrates, which we generally think of the Euphrates as being east of Canaan land. And it is, but it's such a long river, it also bends up around to the north. And so from the north at the river Euphrates to the south, the river of Egypt, that strip of land that's between those two things are going to be yours. Now, 1 Kings chapter 4, during the reign of Solomon, David's son, we see where it states explicitly that this promise had been fulfilled. Now, it was fulfilled before this, but we just want to notice it specifically mentions these things. In 1 Kings 4, verse 21, so Solomon reigned over all the kingdoms from the river to the land of the Philistines as far as the border of Egypt. They brought tribute and served Solomon all the days of his life. So whenever the Old Testament just talks about the river and doesn't give any kind of qualifier, any kind of name or designation beyond that, it's talking about the river Euphrates because it was the dominant river. Just like here in the United States, when you talk about the river, well, everybody knows, well, that's the Mississippi. So it says in 1 Kings 4, it has been fulfilled. What God promised to Abram back in Genesis 12:2, he repeated in Genesis 15, he repeated it to his descendants, to Isaac and to Jacob. This land, he says, I'm going to give you, and it was fulfilled. Now, another place to look to know that it was fulfilled, because, there's people today who still think, well, this is yet unfulfilled. Well, no. God did exactly what he promised for the children of Israel, for the descendants of Abraham. In Joshua chapter 21, verse 43, it says, the Lord God gave Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. You see how that Joshua declares that the promise God made regarding that land and more, but specifically that land that he had promised to Abram all the way back in Genesis 12 and Genesis 15, he had fulfilled. Not one word failed. So God made a promise and he fulfilled that promise. We'll come back to that thought in just a minute. But God promised to make his name great as well and make him a great nation, back in Genesis 12, verse 3. Now, remember that when he made that promise, Abram did not have any children, none whatsoever. He didn't even have Ishmael at that point. But he promised that he would make him a great nation. Remember that Sarah was past the age of childbearing. Abram was 75 years old when he was called out of Ur of the Chaldees. When he left Haran, it specifically says he was 75 years old. So he was considered to be beyond with his wife, the time of life to have children. He was very concerned about that, and you see that play out in the record of his life in the book of Genesis. But God does work that out in giving him Isaac by Sarah, and then Isaac having Jacob, and then Jacob having his 12 sons, and then them going down into the land of Egypt and multiplying greatly in the land of Egypt. And remember, that's part of what the Egyptians were concerned about, because the Hebrews were so populous down there. They were concerned that if there was an attack by the enemies, the Hebrews would throw in with them and overthrow the Egyptians. But I want to notice this in Hebrews 12, verse 37, when the children of Israel are coming up out of the land of Egypt. This is the Exodus, of course. But Exodus 12, verse 37 says, Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides children. 600,000 on foot. That's the men. And that's really the men of fighting age. And people who know a whole lot more about this than I do, which I know next to nothing about, populations and how do you figure out the number of people if you know the number of men between certain ages, say between the ages of 20 and 55. Well, how many other people are going to be in the typical society? Well, it's estimated 1.5 to 2 million people. That's a lot of people. So that's a nation. Think about that. When he said he would make his name great, and his name is great, and make a nation of him, even though he didn't have any children when God made that promise, that God fulfilled that promise. And when you think about a nation, it's not just a large group of people, is it? But there is some way to distinguish or to identify that nation. And I would submit to you in Exodus chapter 20, when the Lord speaks the 10 Commandments, and then, of course, he proceeds to give the law to Moses, that became known as the law of Moses, that law helped to define them as a nation and a unique people. Not just their genetic descent from Abraham, but also that law that was given to establish them as a nation. They were given rulers in that nation. And so you just trace all of that out from really the book of Exodus going forward into the books of Joshua, into Judges even, but especially in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, when you have Saul and David and Solomon, and you have those rulers over them. They are a defined nation dwelling in a land that God had given to them, following, or at least They had the law of God as their constitution, the Old Testament law, that is the law of Moses, that was given for the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham through Jacob. So he made him that promise, and he fulfilled that promise of making him a great nation, making his name great. But then God also promised to bless all the families of the earth in Genesis 12, verse 3. And he would bless those who blessed Abram and curse those who cursed him. You can see that unfold throughout that Old Testament account with Abraham and then even with his descendants. And it's repeated in Genesis 26, verse 4. But something I want to point out in Galatians, so in the New Testament, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 16, where the Apostle Paul, by inspiration, gives us commentary on this promise and the fulfillment of that promise to bless all the families of the earth through Abram. In Galatians 3, verse 16, says, "Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made." He does not say, "and to seeds as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, who is Christ." So he made that promise that through his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed. And that's through Christ, because Christ gave his life. He sacrificed his life for the sins of mankind. And those who come to Christ, submit to him, are blessed to have redemption and the hope of everlasting life. So God made the land promise, he made the nation promise, and he made the seed promise. And when you look at Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, you understand that that is an outline for the rest of the Bible. It focuses on the fulfillment of those three promises. In the Old Testament, it has a heavy emphasis on the land promise and the nation promise, and how that the children of Israel went into that land after their struggles with faith in the Lord, and then they continued to have struggles to faithfully serve God down through the ages, and God tried to work with them to keep them faithful. And there were these times of greatness, for instance, under David, and then times of great darkness under men like Ahab and Manasseh and others. So the children of Israel are struggling through this time. God took them off into captivity, but all down through these ups and downs in the life of the children of Israel, God continued to point them forward to the Messiah, to the Christ, to the King that would come in his kingdom, repeatedly talking about those things. And in the New Testament, it is fulfilled. What a great and wonderful blessing to think about. You know, when you reflect on this, you understand that when you put yourself in the position of Abraham, you can learn that nothing good should detain, restrain, impede you from heeding God's command. Because Abram had it good in Ur the Chaldees. That was a great situation. But he left that to go to a place that was less developed, who had a less stable society and culture and all of that, not highly advanced. So he had great faith to be able to do that. We need great faith to do what's right for the Lord in spite of the blessings we may enjoy now. We may have to shed those. We may have to leave those behind. But then also, nothing evil should divert us from heeding God's command. Whatever impediment may be put into our way by Satan, we need to go around that, go over it, go through it with God's help, with God's strength, with God's guidance, whatever that may be. And let's understand we are headed to an unseen land as well. We've never been to heaven, but that's our ultimate goal. And God is calling us to enter into heaven. And so we need to keep our hearts and minds focused there, not looking back, but looking ahead to enter into that home in heaven. And know that God fulfills His promises. In spite of all the obstacles, all the difficulties that may be put into our way, God fulfills what He says. Not one word will fail. We will only realize those promises, though, by submitting to His will, following Him, honoring Him. So those blessings that He intends to give us in the promises, we need to submit to Him to realize those blessings. Well, something else I want us to notice for just a brief moment. In Genesis 12, verse 4, it says, So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Then Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to a place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel, and he pitched his tent with Bethel on the west of, and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. So he obeyed and sojourned down to Canaan land. He departed according to the Lord's command that he had been given. He took his wife, of course, but he also took his nephew Lot. And being 75 years old, you can imagine that was no small journey. He took the people who were his, all the possessions, and it's telling us that it's a permanent move. He's not just going exploring and, he's got a backup plan if things don't work out or he doesn't like it. No, he's taken everything and he's completely resettling, if you will. Although he sojourned in the land, he was a stranger and a pilgrim in that land. This was a permanent move. No going back. And we need to have that kind of conviction and attitude as well. When we decide to obey God, we need to have that conviction. There's no turning back. This is a one-way thing for me. And it tells us there that he stopped in Shechem and that Canaanites were still in the land. The land was occupied by people who did not want to give it up, and they were not of the same faith as Abram. But as the Bible tells us, their sin was not yet full. There was still time that the Lord was going to give before he ended up running these people out of the land. He does that later, of course, the book of Joshua. But the Lord appeared to him here, and he took faith in God to see his promise. He put his faith in God to be able to see this promise. And Abraham needed God to realize this promise and to possess the land. And when he got there, he recognized that, and he built an altar to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. And it tells about a couple different places that he stops, but the idea is he's in this land. He is settling in this land, so to speak. This is his new home, this area, the land of Canaan. However, there's something that occurred that Abram ended up temporarily leaving here because of the circumstances that arose. In Genesis 12, verses 10 and following there, he ended up going to the land of Egypt. It says in Genesis 12, verse 10, because there was a famine in the land, and he went down to the land of Egypt. Now, this is foreshadowing what his descendants are going to do when, remember, Jacob and his family end up going down to the land of Egypt because of the famine that existed. And Joseph looked out for them, and they went and settled in the area of Goshen. And so God provided for them. And the reason that occurred, of course, with the descendants is because they were isolated in that land. They weren't among the people of Canaan. They weren't being influenced by them. The Egyptians didn't want anything to do with the Israelites, and so they lived an isolated life, and they grew there. But Abram, Genesis 12, goes down to Egypt because of famine. And remember that here is where we read about this compromise that he makes. And Abram and Sarai agree to lie. Verse 11. It came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you." So the famine forced the move. It could be that in God's providence, he's testing Abraham's faith. Are you going to have faith in me in these difficult circumstances? Are you going to have faith in me in my promises? Will you return to the land of Canaan later? But here it is. This is a time of difficulty, and Abram, as he's headed into the land of Egypt, he's worried about being killed because he thinks somebody's going to take Sarai away from him. One thing that tells you is that evidently down in Egypt there was moral corruption, and it was not unusual. In fact, history tells us it wasn't necessarily out of the realm of possibility for someone to kill Abram and take his wife. But it also reflects a lack of trust in God. So they planned to deceive the Egyptians. And then Abram may have thought he could control the situation as her brother and fend off any suitors to her. Because as her brother, so to speak, he would be the one that men would approach to get his permission to take Sarai as their wives. So maybe he thought, well, I can control that here. Well, you read then at verses 14 to 20, where Pharaoh discovered the deceit and rebuked Abram. So it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw that the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, 'She is my sister'? I might have taken her as my wife. Now, therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way." So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So Sarai being commended to Pharaoh by his servants created a secondary problem, right? The primary problem is what Abram and Sarai agreed to do in deceiving the Egyptians. And them going on the assumption that that was fact, they decided they wanted to have this relationship with Sarai. They wanted to make an alliance, essentially. Here's this great leader of a clan, and we know that Abram was leader of a powerful clan and a large clan. Remember over in chapter 14, he had 318 servants who were armed. They were trained in combat. And that wouldn't have been the only servants, and that would have only been males. And so there would have been females, there would have been children mixed in among them. And so he led a very large group of people, and they're thinking, well, let's make an alliance with him here and take his sister to be Pharaoh's wife. But Pharaoh's house was plagued, and Pharaoh figured it out. Oh, wait a second, something's going on here. Something's not right. And he rebuked Abram. And Abram was sent out of the land. And Bible history of the Old Testament, according to Edersheim, he wrote that book. He says, wording of the Hebrew text implies honorably accompanied to the boundary of the land when he was sent out. In other words, they gave him an escort out of the land and wanted him to leave, make sure that he got out because of this plague that was taking place there. Now, let's think about some lessons just in this event here. Well, first of all, sin agreed to by a husband and wife is still sin. Even though they agree in it, even though they've cooperated in it, it's still sin. And also, sin can put another person in a compromising position. You know, Abram put his wife in a very bad position here. And there are things that could have unfolded that would have been utterly detrimental to her, to their relationship, and of course to God's will for them. Thankfully, God spared them through his working with the plague and with Pharaoh having enough character and moral conviction to say, this isn't right, you need to get out of the land. Another thing we understand from this is that sin brings reproach on God's people. Here is a man, Pharaoh, who's a pagan, rebuking Abram for doing something that is immoral. That should never be the case for God's people. We should be the ones who are the shining light, who are upholding the standards of morality in the land to honor God. And if there are people who don't believe in God, don't believe in the moral standard that God has laid down, and they rebuke us for our sin, that's terrible, utterly terrible. So Abram, in chapter 13, returns to the land of Canaan, and it makes mention of the fact that he's very rich. He returns to the altar at Bethel. He called on the name of the Lord. So he's worshiping God. It's showing that going through that incident, going down to Egypt and coming back, he's not lost faith in God, but has recommitted himself to the Lord and doing the Lord's will. So you think about the beginning of the life of Abram. What incredible faith it took to leave his homeland and all that he knew, to take all that he had down to the land of Canaan, to a land that was not as prosperous, not as advanced as his homeland, to journey and dwell there, not knowing that that's where he would end up or what exactly would unfold, but he did it by faith, not having any descendants. He believed in God's promise that he would be made a great nation. And then to go from that down to the land of Egypt because of that famine, and to waver in his trust and his confidence in God. What a lesson it is for us that we need to have that kind of great faith that Abraham had, but be on guard that Satan may try to get to us to cause our trust, our confidence in the Lord to waver, and that's to our shame. Let's be careful about that. Let's be the Abraham that's willing to leave all, believing in God's promises, trusting that he will fulfill them. And you know what? God will fulfill them. Thank you for listening to the Law of the Lord podcast, a work of the Newton Church of Christ in Newton, North Carolina. Find out more about us on our website, lawoftheLord.com. That's lawoftheLord.com. We also invite you to watch our videos on What Does the Bible Say About. You can find videos on What Does the Bible Say About Blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, What Does the Bible Say About Death, Suicide, Baptism, and our most popular video in the series, What Does the Bible Say About the Antichrist? Go to our website at lawoftheLord.com/what. lawoftheLord.com/what. Reach out to us with any questions or comments about this episode. We also welcome Bible questions that we can answer personally for you or address in a future episode. We look forward to hearing from you.
Come raise me heavenward, O